Okay, we'll try again, round two, for our video entertainment lessons. Um, we are temporarily suspending the Period 3 clause, Period 3 amendment, that forbid these in the future. Hopefully, we've learned from the past. We'll not repeat our mistakes, and I'll have the comment section locked off for the entire video this time. Alright, as we said, we go over the 1950s social aspect, primarily civil rights, and end up with a little bit of popular culture, again repeating the theme of suburban life and some music, some other things like that. But civil rights is going to go into, of course, the next part of the Cold War in the 1960s also. Movement starts kind of in earnest in the 1950s, although we have to remember our civil rights amendments, 13, 14, and 15, going back to 1865 with the 13th to abolish slavery, the 14th, 1868, equal protection, and the 15th Amendment, 1870, guaranteeing African American suffrage to some extent. Of course, soon after 15, that movement to ensure African American voting in the South is met with Southern white disenfranchisement. We talked about the Mississippi Plan, I believe, early on in the year, and many movements and racist, hateful ways to limit African Americans from voting. But these are nearly a century before we get to any real movement by the government for legislation in the civil rights movement. So 1950s, the movement kind of starts, we could say in earnest, in a peaceful way by the African American leadership, specifically Martin Luther King, which we'll see in a second. But let's remember, this is going on for a long time in our country, nearly 100 years before we get to this point. And you can see here by 1950, as this map shows, most of the South still segregated, legally required, of course, from Plessy versus Ferguson since 1898. But that put, by 1950, 15 million African Americans bound by segregation and Jim Crowism throughout primarily the southern part of our country. So, very sad state of affairs. In fact, mentioning Martin Luther King Jr. spent his honeymoon in a blacks-only funeral parlor. It was Alabama prohibited blacks in hotels, and that was June of 1953. Only 20% of eligible Southern blacks were registered to vote because of things like we just mentioned, disenfranchisement, the poll tax, literate test, etc. So 5% in Mississippi and Alabama. So the stats go even lower as you get into the deep, deep South. Television even blocked out political leaders, speakers for the African American community to, again, like Truman's issue, not cause political division and lose political support from the racist Southern whites. That being said, many cannot understand the hypocrisy. Everyone's created equal. 14th Amendment, 1868, equal protection. African Americans had fought in nearly every conflict in American history, and very successfully in World War II, in some cases far surpassing the white units. Remember, the military was segregated in World War II. It's not until Executive Order 9981 by Truman in 1948 that is finally ended. But still, then we come home from World War II, and we're still fighting the war here. You might remember the Double V campaign, victory at home, victory abroad. Victory abroad came a little sooner than victory at home, as we're going to see, and I think we mentioned in class today, even by the 1960s, with full involvement in Vietnam by the United States, we're spending $100,000 average per communist killed, and under $100 per American citizen who's hungry, poor, living in the inner cities, primarily African American population. But with Martin Luther King and his leadership, we see movement in the 1950s. 1929 to 1968, the years of Dr. King's life, sadly assassinated. We'll talk about that in the next section. Born in Atlanta as actually Michael King Jr., his father, Michael King Sr., was also a pastor, who had changed his name to Martin Luther in reference to the German Protestant religious figure who you might recall from your world history, who broke away from the Catholic Church with his 95 Theses. So later on in Dr. King's life, he follows his father's footsteps and changes his name to Martin Luther also. Received his PhD by the time he was 25 years old, very young, and emerges as a leader of the NAACP and the civil rights movement. We'll talk a little bit more about his approach in 1 second. With the severe racism, legal segregation in our country, there were some strides, some progress since World War II in the 1940s, and we see here a great example of that. Jackie Robinson played for the Dodgers, the first African American in the National Baseball League, 1947, who still, even though he was playing in Brooklyn, faced many challenges in his home city there. We have to realize not all of the players on that team were from the North. Many of them are from the Deep South, from areas of the country deeply embedded with hatred and racism. So Mr. Robinson did not have an easy road, but overcame much adversity, and soon people realized that he was revolutionizing not only the Dodgers organization, but the game itself with his just raw talent and passion and determination. We'll see the same thing out of athletes like Jim Brown in the 50s. In 1956, graduate of Syracuse, and followed by Ernie Davis, a lesser known but arguably more impactful Ernie Davis, Heisman Trophy winner from Syracuse University, dealt with the same type of racism in a very tough time, the early 1960s. Again, Truman had integrated the military, Executive Order 9981, 1948. So right after World War I, some strides, but still tremendous hatred throughout the country, specifically in the Deep South. Now this NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, led for a time by Thurgood Marshall, actually the attorney who won the Brown versus Board of Ed case, we'll talk about in a second, and a Supreme Court justice from 1967 to 91. So the first African American Supreme Court justice, brilliant guy, and made many strides in the movement. And here we see Rosa Parks from the famous Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott, the year's 1955. Little known fact, Miss Parks was not the first to push back against the segregation on the buses in that city. In fact, earlier that year, in March of 55, a young lady, 15-year-old Claudette Colvin, had refused to give up a seat to a white man on a bus in Montgomery. She was arrested, put to jail. The NAACP caught hold of her story and thought briefly about going public with it, but pulled back for political reasons. Miss Colvin, Colvin, at 15, was pregnant. And the NAACP felt like she would push away or lose support from a very religious African American community in the South. So that's March of 55. Ms. Parks sits on the bus on December 1st, 1955. And her case, she's a 42-year-old college-educated seamstress on the way home from work. Her case more politically suitable for the NAACP's purpose. And her cause is latched onto by that organization to go ahead with the year-long boycott. Ms. Parks actually sat in the front seat of the African-American section on that bus. The bus became filled. White passengers were looking to extend into the black section of the bus. She refused to move. The bus operator demanded that she move. She's arrested, assigned a $10 fine with a $4 court fee, and again, the NAACP latched onto the story. We see the emergence of Martin Luther King as a leader of that organization, and for a year, the African American community in Montgomery boycotted the buses, which we will tie back into the Federal Highway Act, you remember, of 1956, where the public transportation is then really left to the poor, the people who cannot afford cars, to use the highways like the middle class. And we did mention that gave the civil rights movement an avenue and gave them momentum, so to speak, because by boycotting the public transportation that was really reserved for the African American community and a small percentage of the white community in the South, they had an avenue. And it worked. And the buses were desegregated eventually. We see a lot of marches with Dr. King, we'll talk more about as we get into the 1960s. But a little bit about his leadership style. Again, doctoral degree by 25, preached nonviolent, loving approach to the hatred that his population was suffering here in America. We equate him to both Gandhi, and you might remember Thoreau. Gandhi, 1869 to 1948, the years of his life, sadly assassinated. Henry David Thoreau, 1817 to 1862, a philosopher, an abolitionist at a time when it was not so popular to be an abolitionist, even in the northern part of our country. Gandhi preaching peace, passive resistance. Thoreau preaching civil disobedience and pushing back within legal boundaries. And again, both of them peacefully, and that really combined, you get Martin Luther King's approach of nonviolent civil disobedience and really facing the sometimes violent opposition from the white population, the hatred that got to be very, very nasty in the southern part of our country, with lynching still going on in the 1950s and into the 60s. And there's Dr. King preaching nonviolence the entire way through. Eventually, the Supreme Court will rule that segregation laws are unconstitutional. That movement will be led by Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren, we'll see up here in a second, and right here. Interesting story. Appointed by Eisenhower to the Supreme Court, who will later go on and say it was the biggest damn fool mistake I ever made, appointing Earl Warren to the Supreme Court. The two, Eisenhower and Warren that is, did not see eye to eye. And Eisenhower is criticized for his approach to civil rights, being really more concerned with social harmony and keeping law and order and social justice. And we'll see an example of that later on down here in the Little Rock crisis. But Warren, when he is appointed by Eisenhower, becomes really the only avenue for social justice via Supreme Court. And there's an interesting story. The president was weary of committing to social justice, just like he remembers the effects that had on President Truman. Eisenhower actually had a meeting with Warren and tried to talk him into maybe towing a more even line regarding civil rights. And Warren's response was this: legislation by the judiciary is better than no legislation at all. Even looked the president in the eye and said, "You mind your business and I'll mind mine." To the President of the United States, which speaks to an issue that we're seeing in our country today, the separation of powers, the importance of the separation of powers, and probably more importantly, as we just saw last week, the checks and balances, where the judicial branch keeps the executive branch in line. In this case here, Warren's just telling Eisenhower, stay out of my way and I'll stay out of yours. But he becomes a real motivating, effective force in the civil rights movement. Which will get us to the Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas. You see there the year's 1954. In a unanimous decision, it is agreed, argued again by Thurgood Marshall, that separate facilities are unequal and separate facilities are unconstitutional. There had been a court case before, 1954, Sweat versus Painter. Sweat versus Painter was over the University of Texas Law School, where an African American was not permitted to attend. The court found that separate professional schools for African Americans failed to meet the test of equality. The law school available for Mr. Sweat was nowhere near that of the University of Texas for the white population. And the Supreme Court ruled that professional schools cannot be segregated in 1950. 1954 with Brown is regarding public schools. So segregation in public schools are ordered to end with all deliberate speed. You'll, I'm sure, take note of the vague syntax there, leaving really a lot to the states. And if you've ever seen Remember the Titans and that social conflict there in Northern Virginia, that's 1971. So the courts ruled in 54 schools had to be segregated with all deliberate speed. Northern Virginia took a little bit longer to move, and that Remember the Titans is set in 1971, still working on desegregating their schools. So Ike doesn't help much with integration. He actually believed the Brown case disrupted the customs of generations. After 10 years, like I said, with that Titans example, only 2% of schools in the Deep South had integrated. So while it's a milestone case, while it changed education in America, and is a first step to end segregation in the country with all deliberate speed, left a lot to be determined, and a lot of those Deep South Dixiecrat type states took their time, motivated by hatred, sadly. Okay, we'll turn to the Little Rock Crisis in 1967, where we see here, I have a page for you, Little Rock Crisis. And you can see there Governor Faubus of Arkansas, who brought the National Guard to prevent 9 black students from enrolling in Little Rock's Central High School. That much of a racist focus by the governor of Arkansas in 1967 to use the National Guard to stop 9 kids from going to school, Little Rock's Central High School. The mayor of that town begged Eisenhower to send troops to get these kids to classes. And to his credit, he's the first president to use troops to protect the African American population since Reconstruction. Although admittingly he did so to maintain order, not acting on integration. But the crisis fizzles out. The students go to school, and you can see there with their escorts for some time keeping the peace. Those are federal troops sent there by Eisenhower to counter the National Guard troops by Governor Faubus. Some legislation will pass by Eisenhower in 57 and 60. The first civil rights laws since Reconstruction, of course, they're watered down by the time they make it through Congress. But it does provide for a permanent civil rights commission. So Eisenhower, the president, gets credit for establishing that civil rights commission, protecting African American voters. Again, even though we've got the 15th Amendment since 1870, this is an attempt to remove that disenfranchisement by the Deep South. That being said, still very difficult to get that portion of the country, that Dixiecrat South, to move and be more accepting. Dr. King will make strides with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Again, that's the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, formed by Martin Luther King January 10th, 1957, in Atlanta, to encourage ministers, churches, African American leaders to do for themselves what the government was not doing. So to help with this peaceful, loving, nonviolent approach and organize and fight for the rights that the federal government was not providing. Along those lines, we see here the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which really organizes after an incident in Greensboro, North Carolina in the 1960s. Some college students had gone to a Woolworth, sit down for lunch at a segregated counter. They're asked to leave and refuse service, which led to the sit-in movement, where this Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee organized students to go around to these segregated restaurants to sit in and invite arrest and invite the violence and be spit on and be kicked and be punched and be called derogatory names and pulled out of these places by the police in very violent fashions, all while remaining calm and not fighting back, following Dr. King's nonviolent approach. But this extends past restaurants into hotels, into public buildings like libraries, pools, transportation systems. Across the board, these students were effective. And I'll give you a moment here to write this down. Through the court, Truman and Eisenhower, we see a turning point. Not much movement in the 1950s, but we consider a turning point as there is some legislation, like Ike's Acts and the Civil Rights Commission, Brown versus Board of Ed, and we will see more momentum in the future in the 60s. And you'll notice there in the end of that phrase, by the 1960s, the African American community was becoming slightly impatient with Dr. King's nonviolence. And we'll see the emergence of Malcolm X, who originally takes the exact opposite approach. And we'll see the emergence of the Black Panthers and the Black Power movement and the Black Muslims to fight back, as this nonviolent approach was not producing results after a significant period of time. We will see a little schism in the movement with a disagreement on how to approach the fight for civil rights. But we'll talk about Malcolm X when we get to him. Another bright, brilliant guy, just a different approach early on. He's actually turning more nonviolent and peaceful towards the end when he was sadly assassinated, Malcolm X. So we'll get more into civil rights when things heat up in the 1960s, the next part of this chapter. Okay, quickly at the end, we should meet our 30-minute goal. Popular culture in the 1950s, of course, we've mentioned a huge expansion of the middle class, a huge expansion into the Levittowns and the suburbs, about a third of the population living in the suburbs by the 1950s, where affluence, consumerism, and conformity are prevalent and really making life in the suburbs in the 1950s. Excuse me there for a minute. Remember the conformity. It was cool to be the same in the 1950s. Still, however, millions are living in poverty. Millions are stuck in the cities. The poor who couldn't afford to move out to the Levittowns. And that's all masked and kind of forgotten about because of the affluence and the consumerism by most of the society. Okay, we'll look at a few photos. I'll give you a few key dates and inventions. 1950, the first plastic credit card. 1950, the first plastic credit card to, of course, feed that consumerism. 1954, your first McDonald's. 55, Disneyland, and shopping centers, strip malls start to pop up throughout the country. Of course, the drive-in movies popular at the time too, with the new car and people liking their cars and their movies, which will get us to TVs. You see there are some very beautiful models early on. No remote controls. Someone had to sit close with their foot and work the TV channel, so no one else had to get up. But by 1950, the 7 million TVs, 1950. 55 million by 1961. 55 million, one in every 3.3 Americans will have a TV. In virtually every American home. TV dinners evolved more in the 1950s. As you can see, families hovered around the box, watching right in their own home what they used to have to go to the movie theater to pay for. And again, no remote. There's poor dad who's not yet trained his minions to get up and change the channel for him that our dad was so efficient at. Usually the youngest guy either went there or got beat up on the way, had to go and change the channel as the human remote. But hopefully in your reading you're seeing the TV in the 1950s where it talks about Lucy and Norton here and the honeymooners and how TV either defined society and put out an image that people wanted to achieve, or reflected society, what was really happening in there. But as your reading has been talking about the role of women is really pushed to the limit on these TV shows in the 1950s. Both of these are great examples, as you've read, where there's women are stuck back in the house and obviously have a lot more to offer. And those roles, however, are distinctly defined in those TV shows. Leave It to Beaver, you see here, good example of that cult of domesticity, conformity, the women being in the house, although some continue to work, as we know. And here we see the king, Elvis Presley, 1935 to 1977. Life ends in a situation very similar to the king of pop later on, Michael Jackson, his addiction to prescription drugs. The term, however, rock and roll, not really coined by Elvis. This guy here gets credit for that, Alan Freed. Disc jockey in Cleveland, who noticed that white teens were buying R&B records, rhythm and blues records, African American music, and he started to play them on the radio. Rock and roll is actually an African American term for dancing and sex that was popular, a popular vernacular at the time. He used that phrase to describe his music, and Elvis the King goes on to dominate not just the 50s, but into the 60s and the 70s with a brilliant movie career towards the end of his life. But characters like Elvis, characters like Marilyn Monroe scared the traditionalists. So just like we talked about with the flappers in the 1920s, a really small portion of society that were really appalling to the traditional middle-class married women. See the same thing in the 1950s, and the teenagers are really pushing the limit with their adoration of people like Elvis and Marilyn Monroe. And lastly, I'm sure maybe we've heard of J.D. Salinger, and a good example with his Catcher in the Rye of the Beatniks, rebellious writers, really defining teenagers and teenage life and advocating spontaneity, drugs, rebellion, pushing back, self-expression. Small in number, the Beatniks, but paved the way for what's down the road in the 1960s, the youth rebellion movement that we'll get into more after this glorious DBQ and multiple choice section. So hopefully you've written down any questions that you came across. I'll leave this video up for a little bit so you can go back and with our day in guidance being a little disrupted. But we'll go over Eisenhower's legacy in class tomorrow, and then start to review for our DBQ Friday.